There are a number of myths about deception detection. People believe that if someone looks away or gaze aversion is an indicator of deception, or bringing the hand to the mouth or the jaw, that could also be an indicator of deception. Or grooming gestures like fixing their hair or settling the clothing and so forth, or fidgeting in your chair. All those things are potential indicators of deception, but there's no universal indicator of deception. Criminal behavioral analysis is the umbrella term that covers all the work that we did at the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. That includes criminal profiling, active listening, interview and interrogation, and deception detection. We also study, teach, consult on, and conduct investigative interviews. Investigative interviews can be broken down into non-confrontational interviews and interrogations. But the goal of both of them is to get accurate and reliable information. To get there, one of the tools that we use is deception detection, where we take a holistic approach at looking at many different types of indicators. We look at fight or flight, cognitive complexity, and perception management as three different ways of detecting deception. Fight or flight is nothing more than noting the physiological changes that occur when someone's under stress. Stress can indicate lying. For example, decrease in salivation that'll make somebody swallow deeply, or increased heart rate, or increased adrenaline to the hands and legs. Because our primitive brain wants to tell us to either stand and fight or run away, so it provides extra energy to your limbs. When you're sitting there in an interrogation and you want to run, but you can't, many times you'll fidget with your hands or your legs, or you'll bring them up and then try to cover them in a grooming gesture. When Jodi Arias was brought in for questioning after her boyfriend was brutally murdered, she was sitting there and being observed by a police camera. Now, many suspects will experience nervous energy, and when they're preparing to lie, that can come out in minor fidgeting or grooming gestures, but sometimes there's gross body movements, and there's no better example of this than when Jodi Arias got up from the chair and went over to the wall and did a handstand for several seconds to sort of burn off that nervous energy. It's a perfect example of fight or flight. The concept of cognitive complexity is that when people lie, they try to keep it as simple as possible. They also lie typically only about two senses, what they hear and what they see. They don't necessarily add how it smelled, or spatial relationships, or interactions with other people. And they typically keep it on a very shallow level.
You said you played video games all day on Friday?
Yeah.
Is it just between the time period that he's asking about, or just literally all day?
Literally all day.
So if you think about it as cutting an onion in half, and you look at the rings of that onion, typically liars will lie about the first ring, where they were that day, and maybe who they were with.
At the moment, I'm not really hanging out with too many people, talking to too many people.
But if you drill down and ask them questions about what did they do during that time? What were they watching on TV? Who won the football game? Who scored the last touchdown? Typically, that will fall apart.
Maybe I'm going to my case next time then.
Okay.
And if you talk to one of their co-defendants and they give you different answers, the fact that they're lying really stands out. Perception management is when the suspect tries to behave in a way they think the interviewer would expect from somebody giving a truthful statement. So the suspect might believe that fidgeting would indicate lying, so they'll be very still when they're telling the lie so as not to give it away. But the fact is, throughout the other time, they may have been fidgeting all the time, and then the stillness is actually the indicator that they're deceiving. Then we look at verbal, nonverbal, and non-linguistic verbal communication. Verbal indicators of deception can include words such as like, sort of, almost, kind of. When words like that are interjected in a sentence, what follows is something that the teller doesn't even have confidence in. For example, I sort of did my homework, or I started to go to work. That indicates that someone didn't finish the task that they claim to have done. Nonverbal behavior that could indicate deception are changes in body movements and actions on the part of the interviewee. Once you've normed an individual, you look for changes in their behavior. Someone who's been sitting straight and answering questions directly and looking right in your eyes and being very attentive might become fidgety, strange movements, leg shaking, arms moving, grooming gestures, straightening clothes when they're under the stress of lying. So you have to look at changes in those physical behaviors. Non-linguistic verbal indicators of deception could be an increase in the pace of talking, an increase or decrease in the volume, a change in pitch. Sometimes when people are lying, the stress makes their voice go up a few octaves. And that can be an indicator that you need to drill down on to determine whether they're lying about the thing that you're investigating. The goal of looking for indicators of deception is to then find the areas where you want to drill down deeper and ask more probing questions. Ask in different orders and ask questions around them that may undermine and contradict the things that they've told you earlier. When Scott Peterson was interrogated about the disappearance of his pregnant wife, Lacey, he also gave indicators of deception.
When did you realize you were going to go fishing?
Oh, that was a morning decision. It's either
That was a morning
go
decision.
play golf at the club or go fishing.
Okay.
Seemed too cold to go play golf at the club, so yeah, just decided to 9:30 or whatever than that.
There's a major difference between hearing and listening. Hearing is the thing that your ear does. It's receiving sound vibrations. But listening is actually cognitively participating in what you're hearing. And so if you're writing something down while somebody's talking to you, you can't actively listen. And I'd like to mention the fact that this officer is questioning Scott Peterson and writing down his answers rather than looking at his behavior is a big mistake. What he should be doing is letting someone else write down the answers so he could observe Scott Peterson's behavior. A lot of the behaviors that we look for when we're trying to detect deception are very common, and you can see it in public statements all the time. For example, when President Nixon made that infamous "I'm not a crook" statement.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
He said, "And I think too that I can say
And I think, too, that I can say
that in my public life, I welcome this kind of investigation."
that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination.
He was so nervous about having to say that statement that he had to build up his courage by saying, "I think too that I can say." It's extraneous information. The pace of his speaking increases radically.
That I welcome this kind of examination. I welcome this kind of examination.
And that's a non-linguistic verbal indicator of deception. It's again a change in behavior that's a red flag that I would dive deeper into if I was interrogating him about this. So when we're assessing President Nixon's statements, we look at perception management, verbal, nonverbal, and non-linguistic verbal clues to determine that he's actually lying. During the Whitewater investigation against President Clinton, he was accused of having a sexual relationship with one of the interns at the White House, Monica Lewinsky. And he denied that emphatically, but there were a lot of indicators of deception in his denial.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
In this clip, President Clinton is clearly trying to manage the perceptions of the public. He says, "I want to say something to the American people.
But I want to say one thing to the American people.
I want you to listen to me.
I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again.
I'm going to say this again." 3 statements in order to set up what he's about to say, instead of simply stating it. When you're telling facts, you simply have to state them. When you're telling a lie, you have to convince the people that what you're about to say is the truth. And that's what I believe he's doing. President Clinton is a very smart man, and he's using very carefully chosen words here. What President Clinton says here is that he did not have sexual relations with that woman.
Sexual relations with that woman.
That woman being Monica Lewinsky. But he uses the term "that woman" to distance himself from Monica Lewinsky, when in fact, we all now know that he did have a sexual relationship with her. He also uses the words "sexual relations."
I did not have sexual relations with that woman. Sexual relations with that woman.
He's using those specific words because he wants people to have a very strict interpretation of what he's saying. What he's doing is committing a lie of omission. He's saying he didn't have sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky, but what he's not saying is the guilty behavior of having sexual activity with her. He's implying that nothing happened, when in fact all he's saying is, we didn't engage in sexual intercourse. So it's a misdirection and a deception, but carefully clad in very specific language that appears to be a denial when it's not a denial at all. That's what I would drill down on to find out what he actually did with Monica Lewinsky. After every confession, the investigator should drill down into the details, both with the person who's confessing and outside, to verify or refute the details of that confession. When there's inconsistency between known fact and what somebody says in a confession, that undermines the credibility of the confession. Many times cases will be successful or fall apart based on what happens during the course of an investigative interview. So we use behavioral analysis principles to determine whether a confession is accurate and reliable or a false confession. The thing is that every person is an individual, and we have to make sure that we take a holistic look at all of these things and the entire behavior that a human being exhibits when they're undergoing interview or interrogations.